Hello, students. I hope you are doing well. We are going to have a quick talk about photosynthesis, but also about using the textbook as a piece of reference material, just like the internet. And I had a very enlightening conversation with a student yesterday, gave me some new ideas for ways to suggest you interact with the textbook. So, like this week, we have to write about photosynthesis. So, the nice thing about the digital textbook is you can query it with search terms, right? So, we see here that everywhere 121 references for photosynthesis appear in the textbook. And look, lots of them appear before we even get to the chapter about photosynthesis. So, let's start here though. Now, notice also that the page is highlighted wherever that term appears, which is helpful when you're using the textbook like a piece of reference material, right? You want to find stuff, and that's what is great about this digital textbook. Also, look, if I right click, I have a PC. If I right click on the image, I can save the image, I can copy the image address, and I can put that into our discussions. So hopefully these few tips will facilitate the ease with which you engage with the textbook. Now, here's the thing that was really eye-opening yesterday. Um, the student approached me saying, like, I haven't really handled the figures. I have a hard time looking at the figures. And I start with the figures. I am a very visual learner. And what we were playing around with was this idea that as you compose your discussion posts and as you study for the quizzes, that you think about looking at the images and putting them into your own words. So, like, here's one about the general concept for photosynthesis. Let's pick something a little more challenging. Um, so this is a pretty complex image. Let's take a look at this. Let's see if I can get this bigger. Hold on. Okay, so I just opened the image in a new tab. Okay. Now, the challenge I'm going to make to you right now, and pause the video so you can practice doing it, is I want you to pause the video on this image and free write about it. Okay, a discussion post is 300 words. See if you can write 300 words about this image. In so doing, you will be exercising your mind's ability to retrieve the information, but also to transform information that's being given to you to something that you create. So pause the video here, spend roughly, 4 to 6 minutes writing about this image. Okay, hopefully you paused the video, because you could not have written much in just that 5 seconds of time. But here, let me free write for you. So this is free writing, right? So when I look at this image, I'm just gonna talk about the image. And I am not using a pen and pencil right now. But this is a way to retrieve information, right? So first we're going to say, we're going to talk about the structure of a leaf. A leaf is the photosynthetic organ of plants. So within the angiosperms, we have leaves, and they have this general structure that appears in the center of this image. So one thing to note originally is that the leaf is not symmetrical, right? What happens in the top of the leaf and what happens in the bottom of the leaf are different because they're functionally different, and therefore they are also morphologically different. Sometimes if we look at leaves, we see that the leaves are completely different on the front to the back. They are waxy on the top and hairy on the bottom, or they have more veination on the bottom that's visible, all sorts of things. So here we're looking in the middle of the image at the structure of the leaf. So we notice here that one thing that is very important to leaf structure is the presence of vacuoles. So these big blue blobs in each cell represent the vacuole, the water holding capacity of the cell. So remember that one thing else we can see here is that plants have cell walls. And so we see that the model, the images that describe plant cells are more angular. They're usually drawn as rectangles or squares, something like that. Um, and when we look at animal cells, it has a more amorphous shape, less angular. But within that exterior structure, we have water inside of the cell, and this gives rise to turgor pressure. So imagine, just very simply, like if you had a Ziploc baggie, right? If you just held the Ziploc baggie, just held it up by the zipper above a table, and you let go, what would happen? The bag would just flop to the ground. But if you filled that baggie with water, what would happen? If you held it by the zipper and you set it on the counter, it would be able to stand up. And so that's very similar to what's going on here with the vacuole inside of the plant cell. Okay? So we noticed that in every plant cell there's this dark mass, and when we look at photosynthetic images microscopic images of plant cells and animal cells, usually we see that the stain aggregates in the densest part of the cell, and that is often the nucleus. Other things might appear as well, just like the actual membranes, for example, but that dark blob represents the nucleus, the brain of the cell. Okay, so then in the middle, we see that we have this mesophyll. And so we can think about what mesophyll means. It means the middle layer. And so in the middle layer, we see that there are different formations and structures of the cells. And so we have cells containing chloroplasts in the upper mesophyll near the upper epidermis. Now, that should make sense to you. Why? Because the top of the leaf is focused towards the sun. And plants have all sorts of adaptations. A lot of plants can turn their leaves towards the sun, and they're phototropic. So whoever said plants can't move, that's just simply not true. Plants also bend their stems towards the light by aggregating cellular material on the opposite side, which causes the stem to bend. All right, so now as we look towards the lower epidermis, right, we see that there are openings. And these openings between the membrane are opportunities for gas exchange. And so we're gaining the energy source, the photons, from the upper epidermis, but we're gaining the other chemical constituents from the lower epidermis through the stomata. We have oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis and carbon dioxide as a reactant of photosynthesis. Now, when we look inside of a plant cell, we find all sorts of evidence for cell theory. And so cell theory is this idea that all living organisms are composed of cells. And in fact, evidence for common ancestor theory is the fact that all cells have similar organelles inside of them. So like plants have chloroplasts, which are an organelle that is not present in animal cells. Plant cells also have a cell wall, not present in animal cells or bacterial cells for that matter, or fungal cells. Fungal cells do have cell walls. We can talk about that later. But the mitochondrion, the Golgi, the endoplasmic reticulum, the rhizomes, all of these organelles are common to all cells, and all living organisms have cells. And so when we see this diagram of a plant cell, right, we know it's depicting the plant cell because it contains chloroplast and it has a rigid shape. But we should also appreciate the greater meaning hidden in behind those images that we see repeatedly. All cells contain organelles. All living organisms contain cells, and those are principles of cell theory and common ancestor theory. Now, finally, we get to the single organelle called the chloroplast. And so the chloroplasts reside within the leaf, and this is a whole complex system. It's a membranous organelle. So in these thylakoid stacks, which are these stacks of green medallions, right? Think about how all of those medallions, that's membranes. And in order for chemicals to interact, they have to be proximate to each other. And so when you think about membranous organelles, I want you to think about how membranes mediate chemical reactions and chemical exchange. So in these stacks are called thylakoid stacks, and inside are granum or grana plural. And so what is actually happening in here is that inside of each chlorophyll molecule within those stacks, we have a singular molecule of magnesium. And as the photon comes in and strikes that chlorophyll molecule, we can see a series of events that give rise to electrons, an electron being knocked off and funneled into the electron transport chain, which generates ATP, creates glucose, and the byproduct is oxygen. And so when we think about why oxygen is the byproduct of photosynthesis, let's think about the fact that back looking at the middle, CO2 and O2, right? What stayed inside of the cell? The C, the carbon stayed inside the cell, the building block for the glucose. And so one other final term I didn't employ is that we have the stroma, which is the interstitial fluid among the thylakoid stacks. And then the lumen is the fluid inside of those stacks. So there you have it, folks. I think I just talked for about 6 minutes and I just was describing one image. I hope that inspired you, to potentially take a different approach with your textbook, right? After you've read it, don't read it again. I don't like it when students say, "Oh, I read the textbook 5 times and I still don't understand." Like, doing the same thing twice with it and expecting different results is an example of crazy, right? We need to interact with this thing called the textbook, the resource, in different ways, right? So we could do the same thing with this image about the energy waves, start to understand on the electromagnetic spectrum, right? If you just stare at this diagram for a while, you will get an eye full of information thinking about what is energy and how can we think about energy as both a particle and as a wave. This is the way that we can look at it by studying this diagram. Oh, one thing I didn't mention in the explanation of the last diagram was, why are most plants green? And the reason for that is that the green spectrum light is the light that the plant is not absorbing, and therefore it's reflecting. Plants absorb violet or blue, red, orangey light. Typically, the blue light facilitates vegetative growth, and the addition of red light in the high summer season facilitates the flowering and fruiting of angiosperms. And so there you have it. We looked at a couple of diagrams. I hope this was inspiring to you. The next time you have to write a discussion post, I urge you to open up the photosynthesis chapter. And yes, I've asked you to describe different forms of photosynthesis, but you can describe any of these images. If you describe any image, I will be super happy and happy to know that you watched the video, right? Because this is my way of delivering instruction, and I hope that you find it helpful. Thank you.